Vernon Strake didn't knock. He walked into Thatcher Boone's kitchen like he already owned it, dropped a folded document on the table, and said 4 words that made Mabel Whitlock's hands go still over the dough she was working. Sign it, or burn. Nobody moved. 14 ranch hands sat frozen at their breakfast. Thatcher's jaw tightened, and Strake, dressed in his clean banker's coat, not a speck of dust on him, just smiled the way Minsons smile when they already know how the story ends. He had destroyed her once before. A different kitchen, a different life, a different woman who had nothing left. But that was before Mabel learned what she was actually capable of. If you had been sitting at that table a stranger, barely a week into the job, hands still rough from the road, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this channel tells the kind of stories that stay with you. Real grit, real heart, real people fighting back when everything is stacked against them. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Like this video if you want more, and let's get into the full story. Don't you dare leave before the end. The road outside Cinder Bluff didn't have a name. Most roads out there didn't. It was just a long, pale scar cut through dry grass and scrub, running west until it disappeared into the kind of flat horizon that made a person feel very small and very alone at the same time. Mabel Whitlock had been walking it for the better part of 2 days. She wasn't counting miles anymore. She'd stopped doing that somewhere this afternoon, when the blisters on her left heel had gone from burning to numb, and she decided that paying attention to distance was just another way of reminding herself how far she still had to go. So she walked. 1 foot, then the other. That was the whole plan. Her dress had started the journey a faded blue. It was mostly gray now, gray with road dust, and one dark streak across the hem where she had slipped crossing a dry creek bed the morning before. Caught herself on a rock. Torn the fabric a little. Sat there for a moment, with her hands bleeding, and thought about how everything in the past 8 months seemed determined to make her feel small. Her husband, Daniel, had died in February. Fever, fast, and without warning, the way fevers out here tended to go. There had been no time to prepare, no time to make any arrangements, no long goodbye. 1 week he was complaining about a draft coming through the bedroom window, and the next week Mabel was standing outside in the cold watching neighbors. She barely knew carry a pine box away from her front door. After the funeral, she thought the worst was behind her. She was wrong. The men who came in March didn't introduce themselves as predators. They came with paperwork polite. Paperwork, official-looking, full of words she had to read 3 times before she understood them. The farm, they explained, had been used as collateral for a loan Daniel had taken 2 years before they were married, one he had never fully disclosed to her. The debt had compounded. There were fees. There were penalties. There was interest stacked on interest like firewood in November. She'd tried to argue. She'd tried to negotiate. She'd sat across the table from a man in a good coat in a small office in a town 20 miles from home, and she'd made her case as clearly and calmly as she could, because she had always believed that reasonable people, presented with facts, would make reasonable decisions. The man had listened, nodded, and then explained that the process had already been initiated and there was nothing to be done. By April, the house was gone. The land was gone. The chickens were gone. The vegetable garden was gone. And the small oak tree Daniel had planted the year. They were married. The one that just asked her to actually look like a tree was gone too. Now part of someone else's property. Mabel had packed 2 bags and started walking. She'd tried to find work in 3 towns before Cinder Bluff. The truth was, she was good at many things. She could cook, really cook, the kind of cooking that fed large groups of people efficiently and without waste. She could manage a household budget to within a few cents a month. She could read a contract, keep records, handle inventory, and when she needed to, she could be persuasive in a quiet, firm way that didn't require raising her voice. But when she walked into a kitchen or a boarding house or a dry goods store asking for work, what employers saw something different. They saw a woman who was visibly exhausted, a woman with dusty clothes and shadows under her eyes and the particular kind of hollow cheekbones that come from not eating enough for too long. They saw desperation, and desperation, she had learned, made people uncomfortable. It made them nervous. It made them wonder what's wrong with you, what you had done to end up like this, why they should take a chance on someone who couldn't seem to hold her own life together. She had heard no enough times that the word had started to lose its sting. That was almost worse. By the time she reached the stretch of road outside Cinder Bluff, she had maybe a day's worth of food left, almost no money, and a weariness that had moved past the physical and settled somewhere deeper. It wasn't that she wanted to stop. It was more that she couldn't quite remember, in that moment, what she was supposed to be moving toward. She sat down at the side of the road. Just for a minute, she told herself. That was when she heard the horse. Thatcher Boone was not, by his own admission, a man who spent much time thinking about whether he was making the right decision. He tended to act first and sort out the reasoning later, which had served him tolerably well in most areas of his life, and caused him significant problems in a few others. He was 38 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who work with their bodies every day without thinking about it, and he had a face that looked like it had been lived in hard sun, darkened, lined around the eyes, jaw, always carrying a day or two of stubble that never quite decided to become a beard. He was also, at this particular moment, late for 2 different things and thinking about a third, which was why he almost didn't notice the woman sitting by the road. Almost. He pulled the horse up about 20 yards past her, sat there for a second, then turned back. She didn't look up when he came alongside her. She was staring at the ground with the particular focus of someone who was trying very hard not to cry in front of a stranger. "You hurt?" he asked. "No, you sure? Because you're sitting in the middle of nowhere in the afternoon heat, and you've got blood on your hands." She looked at her hands. The scrape from the creek bed had dried, and she'd forgotten about it. "I slipped yesterday," she said. "It's not serious." "Where are you headed?" A pause. Long enough that he started to think she wasn't going to answer. "I don't know yet," she said finally. He was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for him. He had a bad habit of filling silences. "I've got a ranch about 4 miles north. Ember Creek." He shifted in the saddle. "I need a cook. My last one walked off 2 weeks ago, and I've got 14 men threatening to quit over the food situation, it's a problem." She looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were dark brown and smarter than he expected. The kind of eyes that assessed you quickly and thoroughly without being obvious about it. "What happened to your last cook?" she asked. "Walked off," he said again. "Why?" He hadn't expected that question. Most people would have just asked about the pay. "I don't fully know," he admitted. "That's actually part of the problem." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite interest. Something more careful than that. "I'm not looking for charity," she said. "I'm not offering any. I need someone who can actually cook for 14 working men. Keep a kitchen organized and not fall apart the first time Rufus Pike gives her trouble." "That's the job. Who's Rufus Pike?" "He's my toughest hand. He gives everyone trouble. It's sort of his thing." "And what does the job pay?" he told her. She was quiet for a moment, doing the math in her head. He could almost see her doing it. Some rapid internal calculation that went beyond just the number. "I'll need a day to prove I can do it before we discuss anything permanent," she said. "That's not usually how this works, I know. But that's my condition." He looked at her, this woman with the dusty dress and the dried blood on her hands, and the eyes that were exhausted and sharp at the same time. And he made one of those decisions he didn't think about too much. "All right," he said. "Get up. The horse can carry 2. Cookhouse at Ember Creek was a disaster." Mabel didn't say this out loud. She walked through the door, took a long, slow look at everything, and kept her face neutral. But internally she was cataloging. The stove had a cracked firebox plate that someone had tried to patch with the wrong kind of clay. 3 of the 6-burner grates were missing or bent. The dry storage had been organized by no discernible system flour next to lamp oil, sugar in a burlap sack that had clearly gotten wet at some point and dried in a solid clump, salt, mixed with what appeared to be powdered ash. The large skillet had a handle that had been repaired with wire and would need to be treated very carefully to avoid burning someone. The counter had a list of problems longer than her arm. She had 2 hours before the hands would come in, expecting their evening meal. She tied her hair back and got to work. The stove came first. The cracked plate was the real danger cook on that unevenly, and you'd ruin anything that required consistent heat, and you might start a fire besides. She found a proper clay patch in the supply shed, mixed it correctly this time, and set it to cure while she tackled the storage. The flour was mostly salvageable. The sugar was not, but there was a sealed tin in the back of the shelf she found behind a box of candles, good sugar, dry, about 3 pounds of it. The ash mixed with the salt was a loss, but she found a small crock of sea salt on the top shelf that someone had apparently forgotten existed. She had bacon. She had eggs, a surprising amount of them, fresh from the look of it. She had the components for biscuits if she worked quickly. She had coffee, good coffee, which was not something she'd expected given the general state of the place. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She had been cooking in difficult circumstances for most of her adult life. When you grew up without money, you learned early that the real skill was not in having abundant ingredients. It was in understanding what could be done with what you had. Daniel had used to say that Mabel could make a good meal out of practically nothing, and a great meal out of almost enough. She hadn't thought about that in months. It surprised her now, coming back. She started the biscuits, got the bacon going, managed the eggs in because the remaining pans weren't large enough to do them all at once. The coffee went on last because it would stay good while the food finished. She was plating the last of it when she heard the boots on the porch. They came in the way hungry working men always do, loud, and with a lot of elbowing and commentary, and they stopped short when they saw her. Not slowly. Stopped short the way you do when something is different from what you were expecting. 14 men, ranging from young to old, all of them dirty from the day's work, all of them staring at the unfamiliar woman standing at the stove. "Who are you?" said the one in the front. He was a big man, broad and weathered, with the particular bearing of someone who was used to being the loudest voice in the room. "Mabel Whitlock," she said. "I'm the new cook. Sit down." "Mabel Whitlock," he repeated, like he was testing the name. "I'm Rufus Pike, I know." "Sit down, Mr. Pike." He didn't sit. He looked at the food on the counter, the biscuits, the bacon, the eggs, the coffee, and then he looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile. "That's it?" he said. "That's what you made? That's what there was to work with. If you'd like to discuss the state of the dry storage, I'm happy to do that after you've eaten." "Ma'am, I don't know who told Thatcher you could cook, but we've been eating garbage for 2 months. And if this is your best, Rufus." Thatcher's voice came from the doorway. Quiet. Warning. Rufus stopped, but he didn't look away from Mabel. She met his gaze steadily. She was tired, bone-tired, the kind of tired that goes into your muscles and sits there, and she was hungry herself. She hadn't eaten since morning, and she had just spent 2 hours working a broken stove in an unfamiliar kitchen. She did not have the energy for this, but she also wasn't going to flinch. "I made what could be made with what was here," she said. "Sit down and eat. If it's not good, you can tell me so after. If it is good, then we can talk about what this kitchen is actually going to need going forward." A long moment. Rufus pulled out a chair and sat. The others followed. The room was quiet in a way that felt like held breath. Mabel set the first plate down in front of Rufus because that was the right move address. "Get that problem directly. Don't go around it." He looked at the food for a moment, then picked up his fork. She went to the counter and started cutting bread. Behind her she heard the sounds of eating. No comments. No complaints. Just the sound of food being eaten by hungry people. And then, after maybe 3 minutes, she heard the particular scrape of a plate being pushed slightly forward and a bench leg shifting as someone reached for more. She didn't turn around, but she heard it. It was Rufus. Thatcher found her, later that night, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, sitting on the cookhouse step with a cup of coffee and her shoes off. Her feet were in bad shape. He could see that even in the low light, and she had the particular stillness of someone who had used everything they had and needed a moment before they could function again. He sat down on the step below her, which put him a little lower, which was not something he usually did deliberately, but felt right in this particular moment. "Rufus Pike went back for thirds," he said, "I noticed." "Rufus doesn't go back for thirds. Rufus goes back for seconds to make a point that he's not impressed and he eats a lot. He has never in 3 years gone back for thirds." Mabel said nothing. She sipped her coffee. "That was a good meal," Thatcher said. "That was a really good meal, considering what you had to work with. The stove needs proper repair, not just patching. And whoever designed the storage system had no idea what they were doing. I know. Dorian, my last cook, he wasn't exactly organized. What happened to him? Really? You said you didn't fully know. Thatcher was quiet for a moment. He was here for about 4 months. He was decent enough at first. Then things started happening around the ranch. Fences cut, some cattle gone, fires in the east field. Nothing huge on its own, but adding up. And then one morning about 3 weeks ago, Dorian was just gone. No note, no word. Just gone. Mabel looked at him. And you think that's connected to the other things? It wasn't a question. I don't know what to think, he said. But it's a strange coincidence. She nodded slowly, turned the coffee cup in her hands. Your financial records, she said. When did you last go through them carefully? He stared at her. My financial records. Supply receipts. Expense logs. Anything Dorian would have signed off on or handled. Why are you? Because I know what it looks like when someone's skimming, she said. And I know what it looks like when trouble isn't random. I've seen it paused. Not exactly the same. Close enough. The night was quiet around them. Out on the range, something a coyote probably called once and went silent. You just started this job, Thatcher said. You've been here less than a day. I know. And you're all ready. I'm telling you what I notice, she said simply. What you do with it is your business. He looked at this woman, this strange, exhausted, too-sharp woman who had shown up half dead on his road and then spent 2 hours making a decent issa out of a broken kitchen and nothing to work with. And he thought that whatever Dorian Kells had been, he was definitely not this. The records are in the office, he said finally. I can bring them tomorrow. Not tomorrow morning, she said. Tomorrow morning I need to fix that stove properly and figure out what we actually have to work with in there. Tomorrow evening would be fine. All right. She finished her coffee, stood up carefully, winced slightly on the bad heel, and picked up her shoes. Thank you for stopping, she said. It was simple and direct, and he could tell she didn't say things like that easily. Don't thank me yet, he said. You haven't met Rufus sober. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Good night, mister. Boone. Thatcher. She paused with her hand on the doorframe. Good night, Thatcher. She went inside. He sat on the step for a while longer, listening to the dark, thinking about financial records and missing cooks and fences cut in the night. Thinking about a woman who sat down in the middle of nowhere and still had the presence of mind to negotiate her terms. Ember Creek had problems. He'd known that for a while. He hadn't expected the solution to arrive starving, on foot with blood on her hands, and a question about his supply receipts. But then, as he was beginning to understand, Mabel Whitlock had a way of being unexpected. The financial records were worse than Thatcher had let on. Mabel figured that out within the first 20 minutes of sitting with them at the kitchen table, turned up cup as high as it would go, her second cup of coffee going cold beside her elbow. Thatcher sat across from her with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had been avoiding something for longer than he wanted to admit. The records weren't falsified. Exactly. That would have been too obvious. What Dorian Kells had done was subtler and in some ways more damaging, because subtlety was harder to explain to anyone who wasn't already looking for it. Supply orders placed twice 2 weeks apart for the same items. Quantities listed as received that didn't match what was actually in storage. Small discrepancies in the figures, never large enough in any single line to raise an immediate alarm, but compounding across 4 months into something significant. And the vendor names, that was the thing that made Mabel set down her pen and tap the page twice with her finger. Do you know a company called Hargrove Supply out of Ridgeton? She asked. Thatcher frowned. No. Should I? Dorian ordered from them 6 times in 3 months. Paid in cash, according to these records. But there's no delivery receipt for any of it. What does that mean? It means he either paid for things that were never delivered, or he paid for things that don't exist. She turned the ledger toward him. Either way, that money went somewhere. And it didn't go into this kitchen. Thatcher looked at the page. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was working through something he didn't like. How much? He asked. She told him the numbers she'd calculated. He was quiet for a long moment. That's 4 months of wages for 2 men, he said. I know. And you figured this out in... He glanced toward the window, where the dark outside had deepened to full night about an hour. I've been keeping books since I was 16. My father ran a small hotel. I learned early what to look for. She closed the ledger. Dorian Kells wasn't just a bad cook, Thatcher. He was stealing from you. Question is whether the money was going him or going through him. The distinction landed visibly. To someone else, Thatcher said. That would be my guess. He pushed back from the table and stood up, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her. She let him have the silence. Some things needed a moment to settle before a person could think straight around them. Drake, he said finally. Who is Vernon Drake? He turned around. The look on his face was the particular combination of tired and angry comes from fight something for too long without being sure where the fight actually is. He's a banker out of the county seat, has been buying up property in the valley for the past 3 years. He wants the water rights on the North Creek, the one that runs through my land. Without that water, the ranches on the east side of the valley can't function in a dry summer. If he controls it, he controls them, and you won't sell. He's offered 4 times. Each time the offer gets a little lower, which tells you how confident he is that I'll eventually have no choice. Mabel was quiet for a moment, looking at the ledger. And the trouble started about 4 months ago, she said, same time Dorian arrived. Thatcher looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. They didn't need to. You need to get someone to look at those records officially, Mabel said. Not just you and me at a kitchen table. Someone who knows the law. There's an attorney in Cinder Bluff, Gideon Voss. He's good, stubborn, does things the right way even when the right way is slower. Then talk to him soon. She gathered the papers into a neat stack. And in the meantime, I need you to tell me something honestly. All right. How bad is the situation? Not what you've told the men. The actual situation. He looked at the table for a moment. If I lose another 30 head of cattle, I can't make the spring payment. If I lose the east fence again and the herd drifts before roundup, I'm behind for the whole season. If both happen, he stopped. If both happen, Straight gets what he's been waiting for. How long do you have? Maybe 4 months before it becomes critical. Maybe 3 if something else goes wrong. Mabel nodded slowly. She picked up her cold coffee, drank what was left of it anyway. Then we need to move faster than he's expecting, she said. That's the only way to get ahead of someone who thinks they've already won. Thatcher looked at her across the table. This woman who had been on his ranch for less than 48 hours, who had fixed his stove and reorganized his storage, and made Rufus Pike go back for thirds, who was now sitting in his kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, telling him how to fight a corrupt banker. Why are you doing this? He asked. It came out more direct than he intended, but once it was out, he didn't take it back. She seemed to consider the question seriously, which he appreciated. She didn't give him a quick answer. Because I know what it looks like when someone tries to take what isn't theirs using paperwork and patience, she said finally. And I know what it feels like to not see it coming until it's too late. She set the cup down. I saw it coming too late once. I'm not interested in doing that again. He didn't push further. Some things you don't push. I'll go see Gideon tomorrow, he said. Good. She stood up, straightened her apron, and picked up the ledger. I'm going to copy out the relevant pages tonight while the light's still good. You should keep the originals somewhere. Dorian could have gotten to somewhere he wouldn't have known to look. There's a locked box in the tack room. Use that. She moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. Yeah, don't tell the men yet. Not all of it. Not until you've spoken to the attorney and you know what you actually have. She glanced back at him. 14 men with half a story and no plan will cause more damage than the problem itself. Thatcher thought about Rufus Pike, who had a temper like a dry summer and about as much patience as one. Yeah, he said. You're right. She nodded once and went back to work. He stood in the kitchen a while longer, listening to the scratch of her pen. The first fire of the season happened 9 days later. It started in the east pasture, in the hour before dawn, when the sky goes from black to the particular dark blue that looks like color, but isn't yet. One of the younger hands, a boy named Cleet, who couldn't sleep and had gone out to check on a lame horse, saw the glow first. He was 17 and had enough sense to start running and start shouting at the same time, which probably saved the east fence and a section of the grazing field. By the time Mabel came out of the cookhouse, with her hair half pinned, most of the ranch was already moving. She counted heads automatically, a habit she'd developed without deciding to, and got to work doing what she could do, which was not fighting fires. She started coffee. She got the water pails organized. She put together food that could be eaten fast, and with one hand, because men fighting a fire eat when they can and how they can, not the way they eat at a table. She moved the water barrel closer to the cookhouse door and made sure there was a clear path to it. The fire took 2 hours to get under control. Nobody was hurt, which was the most important thing. The east fence had a 50-yard section that would need to be rebuilt. A portion of the grazing field was scorched but not devastated. They'd lost 2 fence posts and a section of railing on the sheep pen that wasn't even in use. When the men came back, some of them were singed and all of them were exhausted. Mabel handed out food without being asked and stayed out of the way of the anger, which was hot, and looking for somewhere to land. Rufus Pike sat down at the end of the table and stared at his plate. That didn't start itself, he said. Nobody argued with him. We had a man on the east edge last night, said another hand, an older one called Fletcher, who had been at Ember Creek almost as long as Thatcher. I was on the north. There's a gap between the two that's about a half-mile. Whoever did it knew where the gap was. The table went quiet. Mabel was at the stove with her back to them. She kept her movements steady, and her expression clear of anything that might read as reaction, because she was listening and she didn't want them to stop talking. That means they've been watching, Rufus said. That means someone has been on this land, close enough to know our patrol schedule. Or someone told them, Fletcher said. The words settled over the room like a second layer of smoke. Mabel poured coffee and set the pot down. How long has your patrol schedule been the same? She asked. She set it toward the stove, not toward the table, like it was almost a question to herself. Rufus looked at her. 3 months, give or take, he said. Thatcher set it up after the fences started getting cut. Did Dorian Kells know the schedule? The question landed like a stone in still water. She could feel the ripple of it through the room without turning around. Dorian cooked, Rufus said slowly. He heard things. Everybody hears things in a kitchen, Mabel said. She turned around and looked at Rufus directly. Did he ask questions? About the property? The patrol routes? What happened when? Rufus's expression did something complicated. The anger was still there, but underneath it something else was moving, the particular discomfort of a man who is realizing he may have been wrong about something that mattered. He was nosy, Rufus said finally. I thought it was just I figured he was bored. Cooks get bored. He wasn't bored, Mabel said. She said it simply, without drama, and then went back to the stove. Most of its windows were dark. There was nothing more to say about it right then, and she knew the men needed to sit with it rather than have it explained to them. Thatcher came in 20 minutes later with ash on his coat and a cut on his forearm from a fence wire that had snapped in the heat. Mabel cleaned the cut without being asked. She had a clean cloth and the carbolic acid already out because she'd seen the fence wire situation from the cookhouse door, and he let her, which told her more about his current state of mind than anything he might have said. Gideon thinks we have something, Thatcher said quietly, close to her ear, while the men around the table were talking among themselves. The vendor name Hargrove Supply. He looked into it. There's no registered business by that name anywhere in the county, or the territory, meaning Dorian invented it, meaning someone invented it. Gideon says the money would have had to go somewhere real, even if the vendor was fake. He's looking for where. How long will that take? He doesn't know. Could be weeks. Mabel tied off the bandage on his arm. We don't have weeks if Strake is escalating. I know that. Then we need to give Gideon something faster to work with. She stepped back and looked at Thatcher steadily. We need to find where Dorian went. That turned out to be harder than it sounded, and it had sounded hard. Dorian Kells had not gone to any of the obvious places. He wasn't in Cinderbluff. She sent Cleet in on a supply run with instructions to ask around quietly. And the boy came back having learned nothing useful, except that nobody seemed to remember Dorian particularly, which was itself a kind of answer. A man who spent 4 months in the area and left no impression was a man who had been careful about not leaving impressions. She thought about that for several days while she worked. Cooking occupied her hands and freed her mind in a way she had always found useful. There was a rhythm to kitchen work that let another part of her brain run parallel to it, turning problems over, looking at them from different angles. Dorian had been careful. He had been placed deliberately. He had most of its windows were dark, that he shouldn't have known things about the ranch, known unless someone was telling him what to look for. And he had left suddenly not when the situation fell apart, but before it had, which meant he had been pulled out on purpose. Someone had given him a signal. The question was where he had gone to receive instructions and where he had gone when he left. Mabel started paying attention to the edges of the property in a new way. Not in an obvious way. She wasn't about to wander the boundary fences alone, and she wasn't going to ask the men to look for something without being able to tell them what they were looking for. But she listened to what they said when they came back from the outer sections. She asked Fletcher casual questions about the terrain, framed as curiosity about the land. She looked at the supply map Thatcher had tacked to the office wall and thought about where a person could hide for a few hours without being seen. There was a section of scrub oak and dry creek bed about a quarter mile past the eastern boundary, far enough from the regular patrol route to be safe, close enough to the ranch to observe it. "I want to go out to the east boundary tomorrow morning," she told Thatcher on the 8th day after the fire. "Not far, just to the edge. I want to see something." He looked at her. "Why?" "I have an idea. I might be wrong." "About what?" "About where Dorian used to go when he wasn't in the kitchen." Thatcher was quiet for a moment. "I'll go with you," he said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm going." They left before the men were up, in the gray light just before dawn. She had packed a small bag water, some food, nothing that looked like they were going far, because she didn't want to answer questions on the way out. Thatcher brought a rifle because that was just sense out here, not because either of them expected trouble. The east boundary looked the same as it always did. Dry grass, scrub brush, the fence line with its gap where the fire had burned through. Creek bed beyond dry. This time of year, more sand than stone ran roughly parallel to the fence for about 200 yards before curving away toward the tree line. Mabel walked along the creek bed, not fast, looking at the ground the way you look at ground when you're trying to find something that someone tried to hide. She found it about 150 yards from the fence. Enough evidence of occupation, the disturbed earth, in a particular way, the remnants of a small fire ring that someone had scattered but not scattered carefully enough, the stub of a candle pressed into the sand to tell a clear story. Someone was here regularly, she said. Long enough to sit. Long enough to need light. Thatcher crouched beside her. Could be anyone. Drifter, look at the angle. She pointed. From here, you can see the east pasture gate and about a third of the grazing field. You can see the barn roof. On a clear night with a good moon, you could probably count the men coming and going from the bunkhouse. He was quiet. She kept looking, and then under a flat rock at the edge of the scrub, she found what made everything sharper and worse and clearer all at once. It was a folded piece of paper, weathered but readable. Some kind of a note or record, not a letter, but a list of dates and times and what looked like patrol patterns, written in two different hands. One of those hands, she was nearly certain, she had seen before. In the supply ledger, in the double-ordered invoices, in the fake company records. Dorian Kells had been sitting out here, in the dark, keeping notes, and someone had been writing back. "Gideon needs to see this," Thatcher said. "Yes. If the second handwriting matches anything in Strake's known documents, then we have more than a suspicion." She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her bag. "But we can't tip Strake that we found it. If he knows we're closing in, he'll pull whatever else he has in place, and when we'll lose the trail." Thatcher stood up. His eyes moved across the dry creek bed, the scrub, the distant fence line. "He has someone else in there," he said. It came out flat, not a question. The same thought had occurred to her. She hadn't wanted to say it first. "I don't know," she said, "but it's possible." Dorian was useful because he was inside. If Strake lost Dorian, he might have tried to find another angle, which means one of my men might be. I said, "I don't know." She met his eyes. "Don't start looking at your own men like suspects until we have a reason. That kind of distrust is its own kind of damage." He heard her. He could see that he heard her, even if it didn't make the thought go away. They walked back in silence, side by side, with the morning coming up around them and the ranch waiting in the middle distance, and Mabel held the folded paper in her bag and felt the weight of it in a way that had nothing to do with its actual size. The horses disappeared on a Tuesday. 3 of them, not the old or the most manageable, which would have looked like negligence, but 3 of the best working horses in the remuda. Gone between the midnight check and the early morning one, the gate latched behind them as if it had never been opened. The ground in the pen too dry and too churned from regular use to hold any useful tracks. Rufus Pike stood at the empty stalls and didn't say a word for a full 2 minutes. That was how Mabel knew it was serious. Rufus, without words, was Rufus at the edge of something. When he finally spoke, he turned to the 2 youngest hands and told them very quietly, to check the perimeter and not to go anywhere alone. Then he went to find Thatcher. Mabel was at the stove when they came through the kitchen. Rufus and Thatcher and Fletcher all at once, talking over each other in the low, urgent way of men who are trying to plan and be angry at the same time. She let them talk. She kept working. She put coffee on without being asked because they would need it. 3 horses in one night means at least 2 men, Fletcher was saying. Maybe 3. You can't move 3 horses alone in the dark without losing at least one of them, which means they had a route planned, Thatcher said. Which means they've been on this land again. Close enough to know the pen, the gate, the guard's schedule. Rufus's voice had dropped to something quiet and careful. Thatcher. Someone is walking around this ranch like they own it. I know. We need to hit back. We need to be smart about how we hit back, Thatcher said. Riding out angry and shooting at shadows gets nothing. Getting robbed blind while we play it careful isn't working so great either. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Mabel turned from the stove. The horses will be moved quickly, she said. Sold or transferred somewhere far enough that they can't be traced easily. That means whoever took them had a plan for where they were going. She looked at Thatcher. Did Gideon have any contacts with the Territorial Marshal's office? He does. Why? Because if someone is moving stolen horses out of the territory, the Marshal's office might have sight of it. It's worth asking. She set the coffee pot on the table. And because if there's a pattern, if other ranches lost horses the same way, that's the kind of evidence that becomes a federal problem instead of just a local one. The 3 men looked at her. Rufus, she noticed, was not looking at her with the same skepticism he'd started with. He was looking at her the way men look at someone who keeps saying useful things, not gratitude exactly, not yet, but a kind of reluctant adjustment. She's right, Fletcher said. He said it simply, without making it a bigger moment than it was, and somehow that made it land harder. Thatcher nodded. I'll ride to Gideon today. Take Fletcher, Mabel said. Don't go alone. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. Fletcher. Fletcher was already putting his hat on. After they left, Rufus stayed at the table. He poured his own coffee, which was unusual. He normally waited to be served, not out of arrogance exactly, but out of habit, and he sat with it for a moment without drinking it. How do you know all this? He said finally. Not hostile, genuinely asking. She thought about the right answer. I've seen what happens when someone comes after a property, and the people on it don't see it clearly until too late, she said. I was on the other side of it once. I didn't know what I was looking at until the papers were already signed. She picked up a cloth and started wiping down the counter. I'm not interested in watching it happen to someone else. Rufus was quiet for a moment. The fire, the cattle, now the horses, he said. Drake's not patient anymore. No, she agreed. That means he's either close to getting what he wants, or he's worried he's losing his chance. That's what I think too. Rufus looked at his coffee. What do we do? He asked. And the way he said it, not challenging her, not testing her, just asking, told her something had shifted. She wasn't sure exactly when it had happened. Maybe at the table, that first night, when he'd gone back for thirds and thought she wasn't paying attention. Maybe when she'd said Dorian's name in a way that made the room go quiet. Maybe just over the days of watching her work, watching her think, watching her stay steady when things were not steady. We stop letting him choose the timing, she said. That's the thing he has that we don't right now. He decides when and where he hits. We're always reacting. We need to change that. Rufus looked up. How? She considered it carefully before she answered. Not because she didn't have an idea. She'd been working it over for 2 days, turning it like a stone in her hand, looking at every side of it. We give him something to react to, she said. Something he can't resist and can't ignore. Rufus stared at her. You want to set a trap. I want to set the right kind of trap, she said. Not the kind that depends on luck. The kind that depends on what we already know about what he wants. Rufus said nothing for a long moment. His coffee had gone mostly untouched. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, not suspicion anymore. Not the blunt dismissal of that first night, but something more careful and maybe something like respect that hadn't quite decided to admit itself yet. You'd need Thatcher to agree, he said. I know. And Gideon. Yes, and you'd need the men to hold steady and follow a plan without knowing every part of it, because if word gets out. I know all of that, she said. I'm not saying it's simple. I'm saying it's what we have. He picked up the coffee finally, drank it, set it down. "Tell me the rest of it," he said. She did. She told him everything she'd been working through, the timing, the route, the way she thought it would have to be positioned to look genuine enough to pull Dorian Kells back into the open. Because Dorian was the key. Dorian had the direct connection to Strake, the kind of connection that could be proven in a courtroom, instead of just suspected in a kitchen. If Dorian could be drawn out and caught with evidence on him, the whole chain collapsed upward. Rufus listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions, all of them good ones, and she answered them honestly, including the parts where she admitted she didn't know. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. "It could work," Rufus said. "It could also be wrong in several ways. Things that are worth doing can go wrong in several ways," she said. He stood up, carried his cup to the counter, set it down with a care that was slightly out of character. "You'd better be here when Thatcher gets back," he said, "because he needs to hear this from you." "I'll be here," she said. "I'm always here." He almost smiled at that. It was a brief thing, not quite finished, but it was there. "Yeah," he said. "You are." And he walked out. Mabel turned back to the counter and stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the wood, feeling the grain of it under her palms. Cookhouse had been a disaster when she arrived. The kitchen had been a mess, and the food had been terrible, and the men had been ready to leave. Now the food was good, the kitchen was organized, and the men were beginning slowly to trust her. Rufus Pike, the toughest man on the ranch, the one who gave everyone trouble, the one Thatcher had warned her about on the very first day, had just sat in her kitchen and listened to her plan and said it could work. None of that fixed the missing horses. None of it fixed the burned pasture or the cut fences or the financial records with their invented vendors and their stolen money. None of it fixed the fact that Strake was still out there, still patient in the way dangerous men are patient, still certain he was going to win this. But something had changed in Ember Creek. She could feel it in the way people moved, in the questions they started bringing to her, in the small shifts of language, the way Thatcher had started saying "we" where he used to say "I." She didn't let herself feel too much about that yet. Feeling too much about something before it was so secure was how you ended up blindsided. But she stood there for a moment with her hands on the counter and let herself acknowledge, quietly and without ceremony, that this place had started to feel like something worth fighting for. Then she straightened up, retied her apron, and started on the noon meal because 14 men were going to be hungry, and the work did not stop because the situation was difficult. The work never stopped. That was the thing she had always known about herself, even in the months when she had forgotten most of the other things. The work kept going, and she kept going with it. Most of its windows were dark, and somewhere in the distance, Thatcher was riding toward an attorney who might have the piece they were missing, and Dorian Kells was hiding somewhere thinking he was safe, and Vernon Strake was sitting in his banker's office, believing the endgame was already decided. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. Gideon Voss was not what Mabel had expected. She had built a picture of him in her mind based on Thatcher's description: stubborn, careful, does things the right way, even when the right way is slower, and she had imagined someone older, gray-haired, with the particular deliberateness of a man who had been practicing law in a small town long enough to have seen everything twice. What walked into the Ember Creek kitchen 3 days after Thatcher's ride to town was a man maybe 40, lean and slightly rumpled in the way of someone who spent more time with paper than with people, with ink stains on his right hand that he hadn't quite gotten off, and eyes that moved around the room quickly, cataloging everything the same way hers did. He took the chair she pointed him to, accepted the coffee she offered, and set his leather case on the table with the care of a man who understood that what was inside it mattered. "You found the campsite," he said. Not a greeting, not a preamble, just starting in the middle where the important things were. 2 weeks ago, Mabel said. She sat down across from him while Thatcher took the chair at the head of the table. "The paper we recovered, you've had time to look at it." "I have." Gideon opened the case and removed a folder, but didn't open it yet. He had the habit, she noticed, of making sure people were ready to hear something before he said it. The second handwriting. "I've been comparing it to documents filed with the county land office over the past 3 years. Deeds, transfer agreements, letters of intent." And, Thatcher said, "I can't swear to it in front of a judge. Not yet. Handwriting comparison requires an expert, and getting an expert out here takes time we may not have. He paused. But I've been looking at Vernon Strake's signature on 17 separate documents, and I've been looking at that second hand on your paper, and I will tell you personally, not professionally, personally, that they are consistent. The kitchen went quiet. Mabel had suspected it. She had let herself suspect it privately, in the part of her mind where she kept things that weren't yet proven, because suspicion without proof was just anxiety, and she couldn't afford to run on anxiety. But hearing it said out loud by a man who read documents for a living was different. Drake was writing to Dorian directly, she said. That's what it looks like. Which means he wasn't using an intermediary. He was keeping personal control of the operation. Yes. Gideon looked at her with a kind of measured interest, which is both worse and better than the alternative. Worse, because it means he's more invested than we thought. Better because there's no middleman to disappear on us. She looked at Thatcher. If it's Strake's hand, then anything Dorian says about who was giving him instructions points directly up. Thatcher nodded slowly. The problem, Gideon said, is that Dorian Kells has disappeared effectively. I've made inquiries through the Marshal's network. There are some indirect signals that suggest he may be in the Ridgeton area, but I haven't been able to confirm a location. He won't go far, Mabel said. Men like Dorian don't run far from the people paying them. They stay close enough to receive instructions and get paid, but far enough to feel safe. She thought of the campsite, the careful scatter of the fire ring, the candle stub pressed into the cotton sand. He's methodical. He's not impulsive. He'll be somewhere he can watch and wait. Ridgeton is 30 miles, Thatcher said. That's not far. No, Gideon agreed. It's not. He opened the folder finally. I also want to talk about the other ranches. That pulled both Mabel and Thatcher's attention in a new direction. What about them? Thatcher said. I've been making quiet inquiries. The Halverson property sold to a holding company 18 months ago after a series of incidents. The Draper place, same story, 2 years back. The McCready family before that. He laid 3 separate pages on the table. Cut fences. Suspicious fires, livestock gone missing. Offers from Strake's financial operation that came in below market value every single time, timed within weeks of the worst of the damage. Mabel looked at the pages. 3 families, 3 properties, 3 sets of people who had lost everything by the same method, the same patient erosion. He's been doing this for years, she said. At least 4. Possibly longer, but those are the ones I've been able to document, and nobody connected them. Small ranches in a large territory. Gideon's voice was careful. Not apologetic, he was a man who dealt in facts, not in regret about facts. Each family thought their situation was their own problem. Nobody was talking to each other. Strake counted on that. Most of its windows were dark. Thatcher pushed back from the table and stood up. He walked to the window the way he did when something was settling into him that he needed to move around. Mabel had learned to read that walk. It wasn't agitation. It was the physical version of thinking hard. How do we get Dorian? He asked. His back was still to them. We make him come to us, Mabel said. Gideon looked at her. You mentioned a trap, Thatcher said. He turned around. You and Rufus talked about it. Rufus told you. He told me you had an idea worth hearing. That's about the strongest endorsement Rufus Pike gives anyone. She almost said something about that. Decided not to. Some things were better left as what they were. Dorian knows this property, she said. He knows the routines, the schedules, the layout. Whatever told him to do from the outside, Dorian was only able to do it effectively because of what he learned here, from the inside. She looked at Gideon. That's a vulnerability, but it's also an advantage, because it means we know what he knows. We know what would look real to him. Meaning what specifically? Gideon asked. Meaning if word got out, the right kind of word, spread through the right channels, that Thatcher was making a cash payment, a large one. Something significant enough that it would actually affect whether Strake's plan works. Thatcher folded his arms. You want to bait him with money. I want to bait him with the thing Strake actually needs to control, she said. It's not just money. Strake needs Ember Creek specifically because of the water rights. If a payment was made, if Thatcher was bringing cash into town to service a debt or secure a water contract with a neighboring property, that would be exactly the kind of move that threatens Strake's whole operation. Gideon was looking at her with an expression she was learning to read on him, the slight narrowing around the eyes. That meant he was following the logic and hadn't found the problem with it yet. The wagon looks like an easy target, she continued. Minimal guards, valuable cargo, a route that goes through the section near the eastern tree line where Dorian already knows the terrain. She paused. Except the guards aren't minimal. They're just hidden. Kitchen was quiet for a moment. He emerges to take the wagon, Gideon said slowly. And we have witnesses. And we have Thatcher confronting him with everything we've found. The ledger discrepancies, the campsite paper, the connection to Strake. She looked at Thatcher steadily. He's been careful so far because he thinks he's winning. If he suddenly sees the evidence laid out in front of him on a road he thought was empty, he'll understand it's over. And men who understand it's over either run or they talk. And if he runs, Thatcher asked, he can't outrun the men you'll have positioned in the tree line. Another silence. Rufus appeared in the doorway. She hadn't heard him come up and she realized he'd been standing there for at least part of it. I've been thinking about positions, he said, with no preamble, as if he'd been part of the conversation all along. The Eastern Road has 3 good places to put men where they'd be invisible from the road, but close enough to move in under 2 minutes. Fletcher and I walked it yesterday. Thatcher looked at Rufus. You already walked it. I thought we might need to know. Mabel caught something that might have been the beginning of a smile at the corner of Thatcher's mouth, though it didn't quite complete itself. Gideon, he said, what do you need to make this legal? What do we need so that when Dorian talks, it counts? Gideon was already writing. The preparation took 10 days, and they were 10 days of careful, difficult normalcy. That was the hardest part, not the planning, not the logistics, but the performing of an ordinary ranch routine while carrying something else underneath it. The men who were in on the plan, which was limited to Thatcher, Rufus, Fletcher, and 2 others whom Rufus had vouched for personally, had to behave exactly as they always did. The men who weren't in on it had to behave naturally because they were natural, which meant they couldn't know. Mabel cooked, she repaired things, she organized, she did what she always did, which was be present and useful and steady. But she was also managing the timing, tracking the details, running the variables in her head, while her hands worked the dough, or tallied the supply list, or cleaned the lamp chimneys. The rumor had to start in the right place. Not from Thatcher directly, that would look like he wanted it heard. It needed to come from somewhere peripheral, somewhere that Strake's network would pick up as genuine. Gideon knew a man in Cinderbluff who occasionally worked as a courier and who talked more than he should at the saloon. They didn't tell the courier anything specific, just let him overhear a partial conversations between Gideon and Thatcher in the attorney's outer office about a payment arrangement and a wagon route, specific enough to be useful, vague enough to need confirming. Within a week, word had moved. Gideon tracked it through a contact he had near Ridgeton. The information had reached someone close to Strake's circle. He's received it. Gideon told Mabel on the 8th day, when he rode out to Ember Creek. He looked tired. He'd been working this problem from multiple sides at once, and it showed. I can't confirm he's acting on it yet, but it's in the right ears. How do we know when to move? Thatcher asked. We set the date and we commit to it, Mabel said. If we wait for confirmation that Dorian's coming, we wait too long. The wagon needs to be on the road on the day we've planned, because that's what makes the bait real. If we adjust the date, the adjustment gets noticed, and the whole thing unravels. That means we're going regardless of whether we know he's moving, Rufus said. He didn't say it as a complaint. He said it as a fact he was confirming. Yes. All right, Rufus said. On the morning of the 9th day, something happened that Mabel hadn't planned for, which was the thing about plans, they only controlled what you could see. One of the younger hands, a quiet man named Pratt, who had been at Ember Creek for 8 months and whom Mabel had never had a strong read on, came to the cookhouse alone after supper, when everyone else had gone. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was composed with effort. I need to tell you something, he said. She turned from the counter. Strake's man came to me a month ago, before you got here. He looked at the floor, then back at her. He offered me money to report on the ranch. What Thatcher was planning, when the men would be where. Mabel felt something go very still inside her. Did you take the money, she asked. Her voice was even. She was proud of that, in a distant way. I took the advance, he said. I needed it. My mother's sick, I've been sending money east. I needed it. He looked wretched, but I haven't told them anything. I've been avoiding the contact, hoping it doesn't just go away, she said. I know. He looked at her with the particular desperation of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and finally set it down in the wrong place. I know that. That's why I'm telling you. She was quiet for a moment. Processing. Does anyone else know? Thatcher? No, just you. She thought about why he had come to her instead of Thatcher. Part of it was probably fear Thatcher was his employer, and what Pratt had done could cost him the job, the references, everything. But part of it, she thought, was something else. She had become, in the weeks since she arrived, the person people came to with things. She hadn't decided to be that. It had just happened. You're going to tell Thatcher, she said. Tonight, I'll be there with you. He flinched. Mabel, I know, but there's no other way to do this that doesn't make it worse. She looked at him steadily. You came here and told the truth. That matters. But it only matters all the way if you go the rest of the distance. He stood there for a long moment with his hat bent between his hands. Will he? I don't know what Thatcher will do, she said honestly. But I know that what you do right now is the thing you'll be able to live with, one way or the other. He nodded. Just once. They went to find Thatcher. The conversation was difficult in the way of things that are necessary and painful at the same time. Thatcher's face went through several things while Pratt talked anger, which she controlled, and something harder to name, which he also controlled, and at the end of it, a kind of exhausted practicality. You haven't given them real information, he said. No. Can you give them false information? Specifically, can you make a contact and tell them the wagon route has changed, that we're leaving a day earlier and taking the north road instead of the eastern one? Pratt stared at him. You're not firing me. I'm deciding what's useful, Thatcher said. His voice was flat, not warm, but not punishing either. Firing you doesn't help. Telling me you have an active contact with Strake's operation that I can actually use. Mabel watched this and felt something that was difficult to name. Respect, maybe. The practical kind, not the idealized kind. Thatcher was furious. She could see it in the set of his jaw and the way he was holding his hands very still, but he was thinking past the fury, which was not easy and which not everyone could do. You'll need to stay on, Thatcher said to Pratt. Act normal. When I tell you to, you make the contact and you tell them exactly what I give you to say. Can you do that? Yes, Pratt said. He sounded like a man who has just realized he gets to make something right and doesn't quite believe it yet. All right, get out of here. Not a word to anyone. After Pratt left, Thatcher stood in the middle of the room with his back to Mabel for a moment. He could have said nothing, he said. Could have kept taking the money. Could have actually told them things. I know. Why didn't he? She thought about it. Because people usually know what they should do, she said. They just need the right moment and someone to go to. She paused. And because whatever his reasons were for taking the advance, they weren't about loyalty to Strake. They were about desperation. Those aren't the same thing. Thatcher turned around. He looked tired in a way that had accumulated over weeks. You got anything else in that kitchen I should know about? He said. It wasn't quite sarcasm. It was the tone of a man who is trying to find the edge of something dark enough to make a small joke about. Not tonight, she said. He almost laughed. Not quite, but close. The day they chose was a Wednesday. Ordinary enough to be believable, which was the point. Thatcher and Cleet drove the wagon, Cleet because he was young, and the wagon would look undermanned with just two, and because he could handle a team calmly, and because Mabel had decided he was steady in the quiet way that mattered when things went sideways. Strongbox in the wagon bed was real. The amount inside it was not. It was padded, heavy enough to sound right, but the actual cash was a fraction of what the rumor had implied. Gideon had approved this as not constituting fraud in the relevant legal sense, which was the kind of answer that was useful without being entirely comforting. Rufus had positioned his men before dawn. Fletcher to the north side of the tree line, two others farther east where the road curved, all of them flat and still, and instructed not to move until Rufus gave the signal. Gideon was with one of the eastern men, because witnesses with legal credentials carried more weight than just ranch hands, and he had insisted on being physically present despite Thatcher's objection that attorneys didn't belong in the middle of a road ambush. Someone has to write down what's said, Gideon had pointed out, in a tone that ended the argument. Mabel was not on the road. This had been the one genuine argument she and Thatcher had, conducted at low volume in the kitchen the night before, in the way of people who disagree seriously, but can't afford to be loud about it. There is nothing you need to be on that road for, Thatcher said. Every function you've had in this plan has already been carried out. You found the campsite, you analyzed the records, you designed the trap, you managed Pratt. You're done. You stay here, I should be there. Why? Tell me one thing that goes better if you're on that wagon. Couldn't. That was the problem. She knew logically that she couldn't tell him a single specific thing that required her physical presence on the road. Plan was sound. The men were positioned. Everything she had put in motion was in motion. But she had started this in the private way that mattered. She had found the thread and pulled it and followed it here. So there was something in her that found it very hard to sit in a kitchen, while the thing she had built went out to meet the thing they had been fighting. You're too important to the ranch, Thatcher said, and it came out differently than she expected. Not like a compliment, like a fact he was having some difficulty saying. If something goes wrong out there, if Dorian's not alone, if Strake sends more men than we expect, I need you here. I need to know you're here. She looked at him. He looked back. All right, she said finally, I'll stay. He nodded. And then, because he was Thatcher Boone, and not a man who handled these moments gracefully, he turned around and walked out of the kitchen before either of them had to figure out what to say next. Stood there for a moment. Then she went to make sure the medical supplies were stocked, because wanting to be on the road and being sensible about not being on the road were two different things, and being sensible was what she did. She heard the wagon leave at first light. She heard it and did not go to the window. She started the stove, put the coffee on, and stood with her hands around the pot handle and waited for the heat. The morning was long. That was the honest truth of it. The morning was the longest she had spent in recent memory, and she had spent some long ones. Cooked. She cleaned things that were already clean. She went over the supply inventory twice and found the same number both times. She moved the medical kit to the kitchen table so it was immediately accessible, which was practical and also gave her something to organize. 3 of the hands who weren't on the road came in for breakfast at the regular time. She fed them without explanation. 2 of them seemed to sense something was happening and ate without asking questions, which she appreciated. The third was young enough to miss the atmosphere entirely and asked if there were more biscuits, which she found, in a strange way, steadying. It was 2 hours after the wagon left when she heard the horse. One horse, coming fast, which was bad fast meant urgent, and urgent meant something hadn't gone according to plan. She was at the door before the horse fully stopped. It was Cleet. He was unhurt. She checked that first. The automatic inventory, no blood. Riding straight, face pale, but clear. It worked, he said. He was breathing hard from the ride. Dorian came out. Thatcher has him, but what? He didn't come alone. Her stomach dropped. How many? 2 others. They stayed in the tree line at first. When Dorian moved onto the road, one of them followed. Rufus's men got both of them before they got close. Nobody's hurt, but he swallowed. One of them. Second one that came out. Mabel, I didn't recognize him, but Gideon did. She waited. He works for the county land office, Cleet said. He's the one who processes deed transfers. She felt the weight of that settle through her. Drake hadn't just had someone inside Ember Creek. He had someone inside the county government. Someone who could make transfers look clean, make documents look legitimate, make the legal record say whatever Strake needed it to say. Is Gideon still there? She asked. Yes, he said. Cleet reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He wrote it down on the road, said you'd know what to do with it. She took the paper. It was Gideon's handwriting, cramped and fast but legible a name, a position, a list of 4 specific document filings at the county office that would need to be pulled and examined immediately. Did Dorian talk? She asked. He talked, Cleet said. Thatcher said he talked enough. Said to tell you, said it was everything. She pressed the paper flat against her palm. Everything. She had designed this to catch Dorian and hoped it would lead back to Strake. What it had caught was bigger than that. A chain that went from the campsite in the scrub oak to the fake vendor ledgers, to Dorian's hands in the dark, to a man sitting in the county land office stamping documents that shouldn't have been stamped. Drake hadn't just been stealing land. He'd corrupted the record of it. Go get the other men, she said to Cleet. Tell them Thatcher is coming back and he needs everyone at the main house. Not the bunkhouse. The main house. Kate nodded and turned the horse. Most of its windows were dark. Mabel stood in the cookhouse doorway with Gideon's paper in her hand and the morning going on around her, the ordinary sounds of a working ranch, horses in the pen, wind in the grass, the particular quiet of a place that didn't yet know its situation had just changed. She went inside seat. She started cooking because people were coming and they would need to eat, and because the work was the thing she knew how to hold on to when everything else was moving too fast. Her hands worked the flour and the lard and the salt water by memory, while her mind worked through the list of names on Gideon's paper, the specific filings, the particular legal threads that would need to be pulled to unravel what Strake had built. The biscuits were done by the time Thatcher came through the door. She searched for the right word and didn't find a good one. Rungs walks out was close. The way you look when something has demanded everything you had, and then you found out you needed a little more, and you gave that too. There was ash from the road on his coat, and his left hand had a new scrape across the knuckles. She didn't ask it about yet. Behind him came Rufus, Fletcher, Gideon, and the remaining hands. The kitchen filled up faster than it was designed for. People found places to stand. Thatcher looked at her from across the room, just for a moment, and she could read in his face, even across a room full of people and noise, what he was not saying that it had worked, that it had actually worked, that the thing she had laid out on a kitchen table 3 weeks ago, with careful logic and a borrowed pen, had gone out onto a road and done what she said it would do. She turned back to the stove before anyone could see whatever her face was doing. "Sit down, everybody," she said. "There's coffee, and there are biscuits, and Gideon needs to tell you what we have." She put the food on the table. She poured the coffee. She listened to Gideon lay it all out, Dorian's confession, the land office connection, the court documents that would collapse Strake's fraudulent transfer record if pulled and examined by the right authority, and she watched the room react. The anger, the relief, the particular shock of 14 men, understanding how close it had actually been. Rufus was very still through most of it. When Gideon finished, Rufus looked at Mabel. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded a single deliberate nod, the kind that carries everything a person can't put into words without it sounding like too much. She nodded back. It was not over. Strake was still out there, still in his banker's office, still believing he was protected. Gideon had papers to file and authorities to contact and a legal process that would take months and require more work and more patience than any of them wanted to spend on a man who deserved none of it. But the shape of it had changed. The evidence was real and documented, and in Gideon Voss's leather case, which sat on her kitchen table between the coffee pot and the biscuit plate, like an ordinary object that happened to contain the mechanism of a man's undoing. Mabel looked around her kitchen now. She had started thinking of it that way without deciding too at the 14 men and the attorney and the rancher who had stopped beside a dusty road 8 weeks ago because he almost missed her and then turned back. She picked up her coffee and drank what was left of it, which was cold. It tasted fine anyway. Gideon filed the first papers on a Thursday. By Saturday, word had reached the county seat. By Monday morning, 2 federal marshals had ridden into Cinderbluff and tied their horses outside the land office, and the man whose name appeared on Gideon's list, a clerk named Harold Pearce, who had been processing Strake's fraudulent transfers for at least 3 years, had looked out his office window, seen the badges, and tried to leave through the back door. He didn't make it. Mabel heard all of this secondhand through Gideon, who rode out to Ember Creek that Monday evening with his coat wrinkled from a long day, and the particular satisfied tiredness of a man who has been doing difficult necessary work for hours. She was at the stove when he came in, and she listened without turning around, asking occasional questions that she kept to one sentence each, because she could hear from his voice that he had already said most of this multiple times today and needed to get through it efficiently. Pearce gave them Strake immediately, Gideon said, accepting the coffee she put in front of him. Didn't even wait to be asked directly. I think he'd been frightened of where this was heading for some time, and we just provided the occasion. What exactly did he give them? 14 transfers. 14 properties over 4 years, all processed through his office, with documentation that had been altered or fabricated. The Halverson property, the Draper place, 4 others I hadn't even identified yet. He opened his case and produced a page of notes. He also gave them the name of a second clerk in the territorial recorder's office in the capital who was part of it. Someone who could validate documents at a higher level so they'd survive scrutiny if anyone went looking. Thatcher, who was sitting at the table with his hands around a coffee cup he hadn't drunk from yet, said nothing for a moment. So it goes higher than the county, he said. It goes higher than the county, Gideon confirmed, which means the investigation goes higher than the county, which means this is no longer a local matter. Gideon looked at him steadily. The federal marshal's office has jurisdiction. This is out of my hands in the best possible way. Mabel turned around. When do they move on strike? I don't know exactly. They'll want to build the full picture before they approach him. They'll want everything documented so he can't slip a single charge. But they'll move. Within weeks, I'd expect. Gideon looked at her. The marshals asked about you, by the way. She waited. They wanted to know who identified the ledger discrepancies, who found the campsite, who designed the intercept. He paused. I told them the cook at Ember Creek. What did they say? The senior marshal said, and I'm being accurate here, that the cook at Ember Creek had done better investigative work than half the deputies he'd supervised. Thatcher looked at her across the table. She looked at the stove and said nothing, because the thing that rose in her when she heard that was complicated. And she didn't want to sort it out in front of people. It was not pride exactly, or it was pride mixed with something older and more tired, something that had to do with the men who had turned her away from jobs, with the office in the small town where she had been listened to politely and then ignored, with all the times in the past year when she had known exactly what was happening and been unable to make anyone understand that she knew. Tell him thank you, she said finally. I already did, Gideon said. On your behalf. She nodded and turned back to finish what she was doing at the stove. The weeks that followed were quieter than anything Ember Creek had experienced since before the trouble started, and it itself felt strange. Men who had been sleeping lightly and waking at odd sounds started sleeping through the night again. Patrol schedule, which had been a point of constant tension and adjustment, relaxed into something more manageable. The east fence got properly repaired, not just patched, but rebuilt with new posts and good wire, and the scorched section of the grazing field, which had been a daily visual reminder of how close things had come, was cleared and reseeded. The 3 missing horses came back. That surprised everyone. The marshals had located them at a stockyard 40 miles east, identified them by Thatcher's brand, and arranged for their return as part of the expanding evidence collection. They came back thinner, and one of them had a shoe that needed replacing immediately, but they came back. Rufus Pike stood at the pen gate and looked at them for a long time without saying anything, and then went to find Mabel specifically to tell her. You didn't have to come tell me, she said. She was in the middle of bread. I know, he said. I wanted to. He stood there for a moment, big and slightly awkward in the cookhouse doorway, in the way of a man who has come somewhere with a purpose, and is now uncertain whether he's completed it. You keeping the job? He asked. She looked at him. I'm not planning on going anywhere, she said. Good. He nodded once. Good. And he left. She went back to the bread. Her hands worked the dough, and she thought about Rufus Pike, who had looked at her on the first night like she was a problem to be managed and was now coming to the cookhouse to deliver good news in person because he thought she'd want to hear it. People changed when they had reason to. That was something she believed, though the past year had made her believe it less easily than she once had. Rufus was evidence on the side of it being true. She let herself have that, briefly, before she got back to work. Vernon Strake was arrested on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Dorian Kells had stepped out of the trees onto an eastern road and found the trap that had been built for him. Mabel was in the kitchen when Cleet came riding hard with the news, and she felt the information enter her, the way significant things do not with drama, but with a kind of internal settling, like a structure that has been under pressure, finally reaching equilibrium. She thanked Cleet, sent him to the bunkhouse to tell the others, and stood at the counter for a moment with both hands flat on the wood. Then she finished the morning meal, because people still had to eat. The details came through over the following days, assembled from Gideon's reports and the occasional newspaper that made its way out from the county seat. Drake had been taken at his office. He had, according to the account, Gideon provided with careful neutrality, maintained composure through the initial risks, the composure Mabel thought of a man who has spent years believing himself protected by his own system, who does not yet fully believe the system has failed. He had asked for his attorney. The attorney had arrived, reviewed the evidence, and had a private conversation with Strake that resulted, apparently, in a significant change of posture. The charges were substantial: extortion, fraudulent property acquisition, filing of falsified legal documents, organized intimidation, conspiracy. Most of its windows were dark. The territorial prosecutor's office had been building the case with the efficiency of people who had been handed very good materials and knew what to do with them. He's going to try to reduce the charges, Gideon told Thatcher and Mabel at the kitchen table 3 days after the arrest. His attorney will push for a plea arrangement. But the federal involvement complicates that. The territorial prosecutor answers to different pressures than a county court. Will it hold? Thatcher asked. The Purst testimony alone is enough to establish the fraudulent transfers. Dorian's confession covers the organized sabotage. Campsite paper, the ledger discrepancies, the Halverson and Draper patterns, it's cumulative. Gideon laced his fingers together on the table. Thatcher, I've been practicing law in this territory for 11 years. I've seen cases with less fall apart and cases with more go sideways. But I will tell you honestly, what we have here is substantial. If the jury is fair and the judge is clean, Strake goes to prison for a long time. And the other families, Mabel said, the ones who lost their properties. Gideon looked at her. That's the longer process. But it starts with the conviction. Once the transfers are ruled fraudulent, the properties become subject to restitution proceedings. It's not fast. It's not simple. Some of those families may not recover what they lost in full. He paused. But some of them will get their land back. That's real. Mabel thought about the Halverson family, whose name she had seen on a page of notes she'd never met, and whose situation she knew only in outline. A family that had built something and lost it to the same patient machinery that had come for Ember Creek. She didn't know their faces. She didn't know what they'd planted, or where they'd slept, or what the land had meant to them specifically. But she knew what it felt like. She knew what it felt like to lose something that had taken years to build. And she knew what it felt like when the loss came through paperwork and patience and the particular cruelty of legal language applied in service of theft. Tell me what I can do to help with the restitution process, she said. Gideon looked at her steadily. You have access to the original ledger records, he said. The ones you analyzed. Yes. There may be additional properties in those records that we haven't identified yet. Cross-referenced against the county filing history, they could build out the full picture of what Strake took. He hesitated. Detailed work. Time-consuming. I know what detailed work looks like, she said. Bring me what you have. Thatcher found her at the kitchen table 11 days later, at close to midnight, surrounded by Gideon's files and her own handwritten cross-reference sheets, with a cold cup of coffee at her elbow and the lamp turned as high as she ever put it. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the table, at the organized chaos of it, the pages in their piles, the running totals on the right-hand sheet, the 3 flagged files that she'd moved to a separate stack because they needed Gideon's attention before anything else. You've been at this since supper, he said. I know. Pulled out the chair across from her and sat. Not with coffee, not with anything. Just sat. Mabel. There are 2 more properties in here that Gideon doesn't have yet, she said without looking up. A family named Kellison, and another one that might be a false company front. I need Gideon to confirm. But if I'm reading these figures right, Strake's network touched at least 16 properties, not 14. Mabel. The way he said it the second time was different. She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression she had caught on him occasionally over the past week, next the one she found hardest to read, because it was the most unguarded, and unguarded was not something Thatcher Boone did easily or often. This can wait until morning, he said. It can. But I'm not tired. You're always not tired. You haven't been tired once since you got here, at least not where anyone could see it. She looked at him for a moment. Is that a criticism? No. He wasn't good at this part. She could see him finding the words, the way you find something in a dark room, carefully and with some uncertainty. You've done enough. For tonight. There are 2 families in these files who don't know yet that they might get their land back. And they'll still not know tomorrow morning. And you finding it tonight at midnight versus finding it tomorrow after you've slept is not going to change their lives by enough to matter. She looked back at the pages. He was right. And she knew he was right, and the fact that he was right didn't change the feeling that had been driving her. Through the past, the need to keep moving, to keep doing, to not stop, because stopping felt like it might let something in that she wasn't ready for. Mabel, he said, third time now. What are you not stopping for? Question landed differently than she expected. She put the pen down. She had been so busy, deliberately, purposefully busy, that she had not had time to sit still long enough to feel the things she was evidently keeping at bay through motion. The kitchen at night was familiar and safe and full of purpose, and purpose was what she had built her survival on since February, since the pine box and the cold morning and the paperwork and the road. If I stop, she said, and then she stopped. Looked at the table. I don't know. I haven't tested it. He didn't say anything to that. He just waited, which was one of the things she had come to understand about Thatcher, that he could wait when it mattered, and that the waiting was itself a form of attention. I'm afraid it'll catch up, she said finally. It was a simple sentence for something that felt enormous, and she was oddly relieved that it came out simply. All of it. Daniel, the house, the road, the months before I got here. She looked up at him. I've been moving fast enough that it's been behind me. I'm not sure what happens when I slow down. He was quiet for a moment. I lost my wife 4 years ago, he said. He said it the way he said things that cost him flat, factual, not inviting pity. She was sick for a long time, and then she wasn't anymore. And I did what you're doing for almost 2 years. Kept this ranch going, kept moving, kept being useful. He paused. And then one January I got sick myself, just a bad cold, and I had to stay in bed for 4 days. And I couldn't run from anything for 4 days. What happened? Caught up. He looked at her steadily, and it was bad. And then it was less bad. And then it was just the shape of something that was real that happened. Something I carried differently than before. He leaned forward slightly on the table. It didn't destroy me, Mabel. It was what it was. And I got through it, and I was still here on the other side. She was quiet. I'm not saying slow down tonight, he said. I'm saying the thing you're running from is going to wait for you. Patient. And running from it is costing you things. What things? He looked at her with that unguarded expression again, the one she found hard to meet directly. Sleep for one, he said, and probably a few other things that aren't my business yet. The word yet sat in the air between them. She picked up the pen, put it down again. 5 more minutes, she said. I want to mark the Kellison file so I don't lose the thread. 5 minutes, he agreed. And he stayed at the table while she finished the notation, which she had not expected and which meant something she wasn't ready to examine in detail tonight. Capted windows were dark. When she capped the ink and stacked the pages, he walked her to the cookhouse door and said goodnight the way you say it to someone who is becoming important carefully, like it matters that the word lands right. She went inside and sat on the edge of her cot and waited for the thing he'd said was patient to arrive. It arrived. It was not, as it turned out, entirely unlike what he had described. It was bad, in the particular private way of grief that has been deferred, the kind that comes without warning in the dark and doesn't have the decency to be explicable. She thought about Daniel and the oak tree and the kitchen of their house and the specific warmth of a life she had built and believed in, and she let herself think about those things without running from them, which was the hardest and most necessary thing she had done since she arrived at Ember Creek. It was a long night. She was at the stove by 6 in the morning. Drake's trial began in late autumn. Gideon traveled to the capital for most of it, sending updates by letter when the mail cooperated and by messenger when it didn't. Mabel read the letters at the kitchen table, with her morning coffee, first to herself and then aloud to Thatcher if he was there, and the picture they assembled over several weeks was of a legal proceeding that was slower and more grinding than any of them had imagined, and also, gradually and unmistakably, going the right direction. Purse testimony was devastating in the specific way that insider testimony always is. It didn't just describe the crimes. It described them from the inside, with the kind of procedural detail that juries find impossible to dismiss. Dorian Kells testified under a negotiated arrangement that reduced his own exposure in exchange for full cooperation, and what he described the sequence of instruction, the methods, the payments, the deliberate targeting of properties under financial stress connected straight to the physical acts of sabotage in a way that the documentary evidence alone could not. The Defense argued that Strake was a legitimate businessman who had been poorly served by employees acting outside his knowledge. The jury, after 4 days of deliberation, did not find this convincing. The verdict came through on a Wednesday in early winter. Gideon sent a messenger rather than a letter because he understood that some news deserved to travel faster. Mabel was in the kitchen. Of course she was. The messenger was a young man she didn't know, cold from the ride, who handed her an envelope and accepted hot coffee with the visible relief of someone who has been in the saddle in cold weather for 3 hours. She opened the envelope while he drank. Gideon's handwriting. 2 sentences. Guilty on all primary counts. 20 years. Territorial prison. She set the letter on the counter. The young messenger was watching her with the curiosity, with the quinoa of someone who knows he's carrying important news, but doesn't know exactly what it is. Good news? She said. Very good news. She went to find Thatcher. He was at the barn, working on a harness fitting that had needed attention for 2 weeks. She walked in and he looked up and read whatever was on her face before she said a word. She told him. He put the harness down slowly. 20 years, he said. That's what Gideon says. Thatcher stood there in the barn with the harness at his feet and the cold light coming through the door, and he did something she had never seen him do. His face changed not dramatically, not with any of the external signs of a man demonstrating emotion, just changed. Something in it released that had been held a long time. He turned away from her for a moment, looked at the far wall of the barn. 3 ranches, he said, that he took, that I knew about. 16 total, according to your count. Yes. Those families, he stopped. Some of them are going to get their land back. Some of them are, he nodded, still not looking at her. His hands were on the top rail of the stall, not gripping, just resting. She gave him the time. When he turned around, he was not composed exactly, but present. I'm going to tell the men, he said. I know. Go. He went. She heard him calling to Rufus from across the yard, and she heard Rufus's answer, and then other voices, and then the particular sound of men reacting to something they've been waiting for, longer than they wanted to admit, not celebration, exactly. Not at first, just a kind of collective exhale. She walked back to the kitchen and started lunch, because the men would come in hungry and wanting something to occupy their hands while the feeling settled. Rufus came in first, which she was starting to recognize as a pattern. Rufus processed things by moving toward food and warmth, which was perhaps why he'd spent his whole adult life on a ranch. 20 years, he said. 20 years, she confirmed. He sat down at the table. He looked at his hands. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, without looking up, that first night, when you told me to sit down, she waited. I thought Thatcher had lost his mind. Bringing a stranger in off the road. Figured you'd last a week. He finally looked up. I'm not a man who admits he's wrong a lot, I know, she said, but I was wrong. About you. He said it plainly without making it bigger than it was. I was wrong, and I want to say so directly, because I didn't treat you right at the start and you held your ground and it mattered. He looked slightly uncomfortable in the way of men who are doing something unfamiliar. That's all. Thank you, Rufus, she said. Also plainly, also without making it bigger. He nodded once, poured his own coffee, and stared at it. The other men came in over the following half hour, some of them still talking about the verdict. Some of them quieter than usual. Fletcher, who was not given to sentiment, shook Mabel's hand at the door as he came in, which was unusual enough that she almost said something about it. She didn't. She just shook his hand. Cleet, the youngest, sat at the far end of the table and looked at his plate for a long time before he ate. When he finally looked up, he caught Mabel watching him and said, with the directness that young people sometimes have before they learn to obscure things, "Were you scared?" During all of it, Table went slightly quieter. She thought about the honest answer. Yes, she said. A lot of it was frightening, but you kept going. I didn't really think of it as a choice, she said. Once I could see the shape of it, I couldn't unsee it. And once you can't unsee something, turning away feels worse than moving toward it. She looked at him steadily. That's not courage. That's just the math of it. Cleet considered this. That sounds like courage, he said. She went back to the stove without answering because she didn't entirely agree, and she didn't want to argue with a 17-year-old about the definition of courage on the day a corrupt man had been sentenced to prison. Thatcher did not bring the subject up until the first real snowfall of winter. Came overnight, which was how good snow always came. You went to sleep in a cold but familiar world and woke up to find everything rearranged under white. Mabel stood at the cookhouse door in the early morning with her coffee and looked at Ember Creek in snow, which she had not seen yet, and found it different from what she'd imagined. Quieter, the lines of the barn and the bunkhouse and the main house all softened. She had been at Ember Creek for 4 months. Thatcher came out of the main house and walked across the yard toward the cookhouse, and she watched him cross the snow, which was the kind of light, dry snow that held footprints cleanly. He stopped at the bottom of the 2 steps. "Early for you," she said. "Couldn't sleep." He looked up at her. Something in the way he'd come across the yard deliberately, in a straight line, not as a casual morning visit, told her this was not an ordinary conversation. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee. In a minute." He put his hand on the railing. "I want to say something, and I'd rather say it out here, because inside I'll probably lose it." She waited. "You came here starving," he said. "You came here because you had nowhere else, and you were in a bad place, and you needed work, and I offered it. That's how it started." He looked at the snow. "And then you fixed the kitchen, and you found the ledger problems, and you figured out the campsite, and you built the trapping. You stayed up half the nights cross-referencing files for families you'd never met. And somewhere in all of that, the situation changed." She held her coffee cup with both hands. The cold was sharp enough to make the heat of it very noticeable. "The situation between you and me," he said. "That changed." "Thatcher, let me finish, please." He looked up at her. "I know you're not looking for another arrangement, just because someone offers one. I know you've been careful about that, and I understand why. I'm not asking you to stop being careful." He held her gaze. "I'm just asking you to stay. Not as the cook. Not on the terms of that first night on the road. As what you've actually become here. What we've actually become." He stopped. "I don't know the right word for it." She looked at him standing in the snow in the early morning, with his hand on the railing and his face doing the thing it did when he wasn't guarding it. She thought about Daniel, and the oak tree, and the long night she had let herself have when Thatcher told her the thing waiting for her was patient. She thought about the road outside Cinder Bluff and sitting down in the grass and thinking she didn't know what she was moving toward. She thought about the ledger at midnight and the campsite in the dry creek bed and the morning the verdict came through. She thought about a woman who had arrived with nothing and built something, not because someone handed it to her, but because she had looked at the materials available and done the work. "I know the word," she said. He looked at her. "Partners," she said. "That's the word." Something in his face shifted. Relief, maybe, or something adjacent to it. "That works," he said. "It's what we've been," she said. "We're just naming it now. Is that a yes?" She looked at him for a moment. This complicated, direct, not always graceful man who had turned his horse around on a dusty road. "Come inside," she said. "The coffee is getting cold." Came up the steps. The snow kept falling, quiet and steady, covering the tracks he'd made, crossing the yard in a slow, patient way, until the yard was smooth again and the morning was clean and the cookhouse window glowed yellow in the white world outside. And inside there was coffee and the sound of 2 people having a conversation that had been building for 4 months and had finally found its shape. It was not a perfect moment. She burned the first batch of biscuits because she was not paying enough attention to the stove, which she would have been embarrassed about a month ago, and which she found now just mildly funny. He noticed and said nothing about it, which was also the right call. They ate the second batch. Outside, the snow decided it was finished and stopped. The sky went pale and clear and very cold, and somewhere beyond the barn a horse made a sound, and somewhere beyond that the rest of the ranch was waking up to a winter morning and whatever it would require of them. The work continued, as it always did. Neither of them would have had it any other way. The winter at Ember Creek was not gentle. It came in hard after that first quiet snowfall, the way winters in that part of the territory had a habit of doing, lulling you with one soft week, and then arriving in earnest, the kind of cold that got into the walls of buildings and stayed there, that froze the water trough overnight and made the horses bad-tempered and the men quieter than usual. The firewood went faster than Thatcher had planned for. 2 of the younger hands got sick in January, back to back, and Mabel spent 3 days managing fevers and making broth and doing the work of 2 people because the kitchen didn't stop, just because circumstances were difficult. She had learned that about herself a long time ago, that difficulty did not stop her. It just changed the shape of what she was doing. In the months before Ember Creek, she had thought that was a flaw. The inability to quit, even when quitting would have been the sensible option, even when everything reasonable was telling her to stop. Now she understood it differently. It was not an inability to quit. It was a knowledge, bone deep and proven by experience, that the other side of hard things existed, that there was another side, not guaranteed to be good, not promised to be easy, but there. That understanding did not make the January cold less cold. It did not make the sick men recover faster or the firewood stretch further, but it made her capable of functioning inside the difficulty without being consumed by it, which was the best anyone could ask of themselves. Thatcher, for his part, did not handle the winter gracefully either. He was irritable when the supply delivery from town was delayed by 3 days due to road conditions. He had a short and regrettable argument with Fletcher over the scheduling of the ice-clearing work that both of them were privately embarrassed about afterward. He spent one entire evening recalculating the spring budget with the concentrated misery of a man who knows the numbers are going to be tight, no matter how many times he adds them up. And when Mabel set Cowboy next to him and asked how it looked, he said, "Fine," in a tone that communicated clearly that fine was not the word he actually wanted to use. She did not press him. She had learned that too, the difference between when that needed to be asked and when he needed to be left alone with the hard thing until he was ready to put it down. They were still learning each other, which was a slow and sometimes clumsy process, but it was honest, and honesty was the thing she valued most, because she had seen what its absence cost. The word partners had settled into the daily life of the ranch in a gradual way, without ceremony or announcement. It showed up in small things, the way it showed up when Thatcher started leaving the account books on the kitchen table rather than the office, which was a gesture that looked practical, but wasn't only practical. The way Mabel started attending the weekly conversations he had with Rufus about the herd and the schedule, not because anyone asked her to, but because what was discussed there connected to what she was managing in the kitchen and the finances, and Thatcher had started angling his chair slightly when she came in, making room at the table without making a thing of it. Rufus, who noticed everything and commented on things with a selectivity that Mabel had come to respect, said nothing about any of this. He just adjusted his own behavior accordingly, which was more useful than commentary. It was not a romance out of a storybook. Storybooks left out the part where two people who had each survived significant damage had to figure out how to trust again without falling into the trap of pretending the damage hadn't happened. Thatcher had lost his wife. Mabel had lost Daniel and her home and a year of her life on a road that had nearly taken everything else. Those losses did not disappear because circumstances had improved. They sat in the room sometimes, those losses, quiet and specific, and both Mabel and Thatcher had learned separately, and then together, that acknowledging them was less painful in the long run than pretending otherwise. She talked about Daniel sometimes. Not every day, not in a way that overwhelmed the present, but when it was true. Thatcher listened the way he listened to things that mattered without filling the space, without offering comparisons or corrections. He talked about his wife, whose name had been Clara, on fewer occasions, but when he did it, was with the careful honesty of a man who has decided that the real version of a person's life is worth more than the polished one. "She would have liked you," he said once, in February, without context, sitting at the kitchen table while Mabel worked. She thought about that. "I would have liked her too, probably," she said. "From what you've said." He nodded. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. The restitution proceedings began in early spring, which was when Gideon's work shifted from the criminal case, now concluded, Drake beginning his sentence in the territorial prison, to the slower and more complicated work of unwinding what Drake had built. Fraudulent property transfers did not simply reverse themselves. They required petitions, hearings, documentation, arguments in front of judges who had other cases and limited patience. Gideon had taken on 2 of the affected families as direct clients and was coordinating with attorneys for several others, which meant he was at Ember Creek less frequently and communicating more by letter. Mabel had become, over the winter, the person who read and organized those letters. Not because anyone assigned it to her, because she understood the documents, and because Thatcher's patience for legal correspondence had a ceiling that was lower than the volume of correspondence required. She built a filing system for the restitution cases, cross-referenced against her original ledger analysis, identified 3 additional discrepancies that Gideon had missed not from carelessness but from the sheer volume of material, and sent them back with her notes in the margin. Gideon wrote back a letter that was 3 sentences long. The first acknowledged the discrepancies, the second said they were material, and the third said that she had missed her calling, which she suspected was the closest Gideon Voss came to enthusiastic praise. She wrote back that she hadn't missed it. She'd just found it late. The Halverson family was the first to get a hearing date. The Halverson Ranch was the largest of the fraudulently acquired properties, a significant operation that Strake had taken 18 months ago through the same combination of manufactured pressure and falsified documentation that he'd tried on Ember Creek. The family had scattered after the loss. The parents had gone to live with a daughter in another territory. 2 adult sons had taken work wherever they could find it. Gideon sent word in March that the hearing was scheduled for April. He also, sent in a careful postscript that Mabel read twice, mentioned that the judge assigned to the case was known for being methodical rather than fast. He did not say this would be a problem. He said it was relevant context. She understood what he meant. Methodical judges were good judges. Methodical also meant slow, and slow meant the Halverson family was living in pieces, scattered across the territory, waiting for a process that moved at its own pace, regardless of what that waiting cost them. She did not say this to Thatcher in those terms. She said it the way she said most things plainly, with the specific facts, without the emotional weight that would make it harder to think about. "Is there anything we can do to help the Halversons directly?" she asked. Thatcher thought about it. "What do you mean by directly?" "Proceeding take time. They're scattered. They're waiting. They need to be somewhere while they wait. If the hearing goes their way in April, they'll need to return to a property that's been managed by a holding company for 18 months. The land will need work. The house will need—" She paused. "I don't know the state of it, but I'd expect neglect." Thatcher looked at her. "You want to help them get ready to come back. I want to see if there's a way to make it possible for them to come back to something functional instead of something that requires another year of work before it's livable." She met his eyes. "We have the knowledge to help with that. You know land management and cattle. I know organization and logistics. Gideon knows the legal requirements." She paused. "I don't know if it's practical. I'm asking if it's possible." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was when he was taking something seriously. "Let me write to the older Halverson," he said. "I know the name. Never met him, but I know the name. Let me ask what they actually need. That's all I'm asking." He wrote the letter that evening. She did not help him write it because it needed to come from him, and she understood that. But she brought him coffee while he was working on it, which was its own kind of help. April arrived with the uneven warmth of a season that hadn't fully committed, yet some days genuinely mild, others cold enough to pull a coat back out of the chest it had been packed into too soon. The Halverson hearing happened on the 14th, and Gideon was there for it. Mabel knew the date and did not wait with any particular composure for the word to come back. It came on the 17th. A messenger this time, not a letter, because Gideon had learned from the Strake verdict what this family was owed in terms of how the news traveled. The hearing had gone for the Halversons. Not completely, not on every point. The legal reality was messier than that. Some assets still tied up, some questions about the holding company's modifications to the property still to be resolved. But the core ruling was clear. Transfer was fraudulent. The land was being restored to its rightful owners. The process of actual return would take another 2 to 3 months as the paperwork finished its course, but the outcome was no longer in question. Mabel sat with that news for about 10 minutes, alone in the kitchen, before she went to find Thatcher. She found him at the east fence, the one that had been rebuilt after the fire, checking the new posts. He saw her coming across the field and stopped working. Told him. He took his hat off, which was something she had observed he did when something required a moment of full acknowledgement rather than forward motion. He stood there with the hat in his hand and the spring air moving around him. "They're going home," he said. "They're going home." He put his hat back on. How many of the others are still in process? 4 active cases. 3 more that Gideon expects to file by summer. She stood beside him looking at the fence. It won't all resolve them the same way. Some of the properties changed hands again through the holding company, and tracing ownership and establishing damages is more complicated. Some families may end up with compensation rather than the land itself. She paused. But most of them are going to get something real. Because of what you found in those ledgers. Because of what Gideon did with what I found, she said. And because Dorian talked, and because Perce panicked. It was a chain. You don't get to the end of it by pulling on one link. He looked at her sideways. You have a hard time accepting credit. I have an accurate picture of how things actually worked. That's not the same as giving yourself credit for your part in it. She thought about that. I found threads, she said. Pulled them. That was my part. Mabel, you designed the trap that caught the man who broke the whole thing open. You identified 2 additional families that weren't even on Gideon's radar. You worked through the winter on restitution documents for people you'd never met. He looked at her steadily. You can describe it as pulling threads if you want. But some of us saw what it actually was. She looked at the fence line for a moment. Daniel used to say I was stubborn about the wrong things, she said. Not as a deflection, just as a truth that fit the moment. He wasn't entirely wrong, Thatcher said. He said it with enough warmth that it wasn't a criticism. She almost laughed. Not quite, but close. They walked back to the ranch together through the spring grass, and the afternoon light came down at the angle. It did this time of year, long and slightly gold, the kind of light that made the land look the way people imagine it when they are far away from it and missing it. Thatcher asked Mabel to marry him in the summer, and he did it without much preamble, which was consistent with how he did most things. Most of its were dark. They were sitting on the cookhouse steps in the evening after supper, which had become a habit, the 2 of them taking the end of the day in that specific spot, the same steps where she had sat on her second night at Ember Creek with a cup of cold coffee and her shoes off. That felt like a very long time ago now. It felt like a different version of the world. He did not produce a ring first. He did not prepare remarks. He just said it, in the middle of a conversation about the spring herd count that had been going on for about 10 minutes, which was either a complete lack of romantic instinct or the most honest way she could imagine it happening, and she wasn't sure which, and eventually decided it was both. I want to marry you, he said, as if continuing the previous thought. She looked at him. We're in the middle of a conversation about cattle, she said. I know. It occurred to me, and I didn't want to wait until we were done talking about cattle. Quiet for a moment. You're not doing this because of the ranch, she said. I need to hear that directly. I'm not doing it because of the ranch. Or because it makes sense logistically. It does make sense logistically. That's not why I'm asking. Then why? He looked at the yard, the barn, the bunkhouse, the trees at the edge of the property going dark in the evening light. The ranch he had almost lost and had not lost, partly because of his own stubbornness and partly because of the woman sitting next to him on these steps. Because I spent 4 years after Clara thinking that the person I was without her was just a reduced version of the person I'd been, he said. And then you got off the road and came in here and fixed everything that was broken and found problems I hadn't even seen yet, and you made me feel like the full version again. Not the same, but full. He finally looked at her. I'm not interested in any version of the future that doesn't have you in it. That's why. She looked at him for a long time. There was a part of her, the part that had done the math in dark offices and signed papers on the side of roads and learned to distrust comfort because comfort had preceded loss, that wanted to find the complication in it. To identify the thing that could go wrong, the variable she hadn't accounted for. But she had been working on that part, slowly, imperfectly, without any dramatic moment of resolution. Just a daily practice of choosing, when the evidence supported it, to trust what was in front of her. The evidence in front of her was a man sitting on a step, talking about cattle and love in the same breath, without performance, without strategy, without any apparent awareness that this could have been better staged. That was the evidence. Yes, she said. He exhaled in a way that told her he had not been entirely certain, which she appreciated more than she expected to. Okay, he said. You need to get a ring, she said. I'm not telling you how to do this. I'm just noting that the ring is a traditional component. I know about rings. I just want to be sure we're aligned on that. We're aligned on the ring. He paused. I have my mother's. If you'd want that. She looked at him. Yes, she said again, differently this time. I would want that. He nodded. They sat there for a while longer, the yard settling into night around them, neither of them saying much, because there was not much that needed to be said right now, the conversation having arrived somewhere that words tended to make smaller rather than larger. The wedding happened in late summer, on a Saturday with the particular clear weather that comes after a week of rain, when everything is washed clean and the light has a quality it doesn't have any other time of year. It was not a large affair. Mabel had no remaining family nearby. Her sister was in another territory and sent a letter that arrived 2 weeks before the day, warm and surprised and full of questions that Mabel answered in a letter back that was the longest she had written in years. Thatcher's cousin and his wife came from 60 miles east and stayed 3 days, which was enough time for Mabel to determine that the cousin was decent and the wife was excellent, and they should visit more often. Gideon Voss stood up with them, which surprised Mabel slightly, and which Thatcher said should not have surprised her at all. The Halverson family sent word. They had returned to their property in June and were in the process of rebuilding, which was slow and exhausting work. But they were there. Robert Halverson, the eldest son, wrote a letter addressed to both Thatcher and Mabel that was simple and specific, and which Mabel read 3 times and then put in the filing box, where she kept the things she wanted to be able to return to. The ranch hands were all there, cleaned up with varying degrees of success. Klett had made a genuine effort and looked uncomfortable about it. Fletcher wore his good coat, which Mabel had not known he owned. Pratt, who had stayed on through the winter Thatcher, had decided, after the trap and its results, that a man who had come forward and told the truth deserved the chance to demonstrate who he actually was, stood near the back, and clapped with the others when it was done. Rufus Pike did not cry, but his jaw was very tight throughout the ceremony, and he looked at the ground at one point for about 30 seconds, in a way that no one commented on, because there are things that men like Rufus are allowed to have privately, and this was one of them. The meal afterward was, inevitably, largely managed by Mabel, who had firmly instructed the woman from town they'd brought in to help to follow the kitchen organization system and not change any of it. The woman had done so with varying success. Mabel corrected 2 things quietly and left the rest because you could not manage everything, and some things were fine enough. She stood at one point in the middle of the yard with a plate in her hand that she hadn't eaten from yet, watching the people on Thatcher's land, her land now. Most of its windows were dark, though the word still felt new enough to require a beat of adjustment every time she applied it and thought about the road. The road outside Cinder Bluff, the pale scar through the dry grass. The moment she had sat down and not known what she was moving toward. She had been starving and grieving and convinced in a way she was not proud of that the life available to her going forward was going to be a diminished thing. A survival, not a life. She had not been looking for this. She had been looking for work and a floor to sleep on, and enough food to keep moving. What she had found was all of that, and then something else. Not instead of the loss. Alongside it, the loss was still real. Daniel was still gone, and the house still's gone, and the house was still gone, and the year on the road had happened and left marks that didn't wash off with good weather and a better kitchen. But the marks were part of her now, not the definition of her. There was a difference between carrying something and being crushed by it, and she had learned, slowly and without a clean moment of realization, which side of that line she was on. Rufus appeared at her elbow. "You're not eating," he said. "I'm looking at things." "You can look at things and eat at the same time. You're probably right." She took a bite of something from the plate. He waited. "Rufus, thank you for listening. That night in the kitchen, when I told you the plan," he looked uncomfortable, which was his default expression when someone said something that meant something. Wasn't anything, he said. It was, though. You could have dismissed it. You could have decided it wasn't your place or not your problem. You listened and you asked good questions, and then you walked the road before anyone asked you to. She looked at him directly. That mattered. He was quiet for a moment. "You were right about most of it," he said. "Can't dismiss something when it's right. Some people do. Some people are fools." He picked up a biscuit from a passing plate. "You make these?" "Most of them." He tried it. "Still the best thing that comes out of that kitchen," he said, which was, she had learned, Rufus Pike at his most generous. She smiled. A real one? The kind that she had stopped managing. He walked off with his biscuit, and she stood there in the summer light and let herself have the fullness of the moment, which was imperfect and warm and genuine, which was the best that moments ever were. By the following spring, Ember Creek was operating differently than it had the year before in ways both large and small. The financial management was formal now, a system that Mabel had built through the winter, based on what she'd learned from her father's hotel and adapted to the specific rhythms of cattle ranching. Monthly accounts, quarterly reviews, a reserve fund that had not existed before and which Thatcher had initially resisted on the grounds that they could barely afford operating costs, and which Mabel had insisted on anyway on the grounds that the lack of a reserve was precisely why one hard season could threaten everything. They had an argument about this that lasted 2 days and concluded with Thatcher conceding the point, which she noted for the record, and did not make a larger production of than was necessary. Cookhouse had been expanded. Not enormously, but practically an additional preparation surface, a second stovepipe properly fitted, a proper dry storage room with a door that sealed against both dust and moisture. These had been improvements Mabel had listed out in the first month, and which had waited for resources, and now there were resources because the ranch was functioning better and the finances were honest, and what was real could be planned for. The neighboring ranches, whose fates had been tied to Strake's operation in ways they were still discovering, had begun talking to each other in a formal way, actual meetings. In Cinder Bluff, organized initially by Gideon and increasingly by the ranchers themselves. Thatcher attended these meetings. Mabel attended when the subject was relevant to what she was managing, which was more often than anyone initially anticipated, because the subjects that seemed purely logistical supply routes, water usage agreements, shared resources for emergency situations, had financial components that were her territory. 2 of the families she had identified in the ledger work had received restitution decisions by spring. One was a land return, complicated but real. The other was a monetary settlement, less than they deserved, but something. Robert Halverson had his property back and had managed to get 1 full season of cattle on it. He sent a Christmas letter that mentioned Mabel by name, which Thatcher brought to her without comment and left on the kitchen table for her to find. She found it and read it and put it in the box with the other letters she kept. Gideon continued his practice in Cinder Bluff. He took on the water rights question as a formal matter after Strake's conviction made the previous informal agreements void, and the resolution, which took 7 months and involved 3 separate hearings, established a shared usage framework for the North Creek that protected Ember Creek's access while providing documented rights to 4 neighboring properties that had been vulnerable before. It was not the kind of resolution that made newspapers. It was the kind that prevented the next Strake from having an opening. Cleet turned 18 in the summer and announced, with the particular seriousness of a young man who has been thinking about something for longer than he's let on, that he intended to stay on at Ember Creek and learn the financial side of ranch management, because he had been watching how Mabel operated and he thought it was something worth knowing. Mabel spent a moment processing the fact that she had apparently become someone people wanted to learn from, which was new enough that it required adjustment, and then told him to come to the kitchen table on Monday morning, and she would show him where to start. Fletcher retired in the autumn. Not far, he took a small property 2 miles from Ember Creek and remained available as a consultant, which was a formal word for what he had always been, which was the person Thatcher called when something needed to be thought through by someone who's seen it before. His farewell dinner was at the ranch, cooked by Mabel, and it ran long in the way of evenings that nobody wants to end too early. And Fletcher made a speech that was short by design and which nevertheless required him to clear his throat twice before he finished it. Pratt left in the spring for his mother's territory. He had saved enough by then, working and sending money home through the winter, and his mother's health was stable but required him nearby. He came to the kitchen the morning before he left and said thank you in a way that was plainly meant for Mabel specifically, though he addressed it to the room generally, which she understood and accepted as it was offered. She thought about him sometimes after he left. About the night he had come to the cookhouse door, with his hat and the look of a man who has been carrying something too heavy. About the question she had faced in that moment, not whether to turn him in, not whether to be angry, but what the right next move was for someone who had made a bad decision for human reasons and then tried to repair it. She did not think she had handled it perfectly. She had fumbled her way to the right answer, which was the way most right answers got found. That was one of the things she had come to understand in the year since arriving on this ranch, that the difference between a person who did good and a person who didn't was rarely about clarity or certainty. It was usually about what you did when you had partial information and imperfect options and somebody else's problem had landed in your hands. You made the best call you could see, you stayed honest about what you didn't know, and you kept going. You kept going. The news that she was expecting came on a February morning, the same month as the previous year's worst cold, and it arrived with the peculiar mix of terror and joy that accompanies all genuinely life-altering information. She told Thatcher at the kitchen table, which was where they told each other things, and his face did the thing that it had done, at the Halverson verdict, and at the trap, and at the verdict, and not many other times it opened completely. All the guardedness gone, just the raw response without management. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a week." Fair enough. He looked at the table, then at her. "Are you scared considerably?" "Good," she said. "That means we're taking it seriously." He reached across the table and took her hand, which was not something he did constantly or demonstratively, and held it in the specific way of someone who is communicating something they don't have words available for. She let him. Outside the kitchen window, the February sky was the particular gray of a day that had not decided what it was going to do yet. The ranch was just waking up. She could hear the sounds of it, boots on the bunkhouse steps, the horses beginning their morning complaining. Somewhere here, somewhere far out, the particular sound of one of the cattle that always seemed to want to register a formal complaint before breakfast. A year and 3 months since she had sat on a road in the dust and could not remember what she was moving toward. She thought about she would tell us dark. She thought about what she would tell a person, if she could tell a person anything, about what the year had taught her. Not lessons. Exactly, she had always distrusted the word lessons when applied to experience, because it implied a cleanliness that experience never actually had. More like things she knew now that she hadn't known before, or had known in theory and learned in practice, which was a different kind of knowing. She knew that competence was the beginning of dignity, not the substitute for love. That being good at something, genuinely useful in the world, was not a consolation prize, for the things you had lost it was its own worth, its own kind of standing. She knew that grief did not ask your permission and did not follow your schedule, and that trying to outrun it only delayed the reckoning. That sitting still long enough to let it arrive was not weakness. It was the price of being honest with yourself. She knew that the people who had dismissed her, the employers who had seen an exhausted woman on a road and turned away, the bank men who had used her loss against her, the ranch hands who had assumed she would be gone in a week, had not seen her clearly. But she had made the same mistake in reverse. She had let their vision of her become the measure she used for herself, and the damage from that had taken a long time to undo. She knew that trust was not a switch. You did not decide to trust and then trust. You made small decisions, over and over, to act as if trust were possible, and if enough of those decisions were met with something real, trust arrived, gradually, as a fact, rather than a hope, and that this was true of trusting other people, and of trusting yourself. She knew that a life that has been broken apart is not necessarily finished. She knew this not as an inspiring statement, but as a documented fact of her own experience. She had arrived at this place with nothing, which was not a metaphor. She had arrived with 2 bags and a bad heel and 3 days of hunger, and she was sitting here now in a warm kitchen with her husband's hand over hers and a ranch around them that was functioning and a future that was real. It was not the life she had planned. It was, in the ways that ultimately mattered, more than she had thought she deserved when she sat down on that dusty road and ran out of the energy to pretend otherwise. She thought about the woman on the road. She thought about her in the way you think about someone who is no longer exactly you, recognizable, continuous, but changed enough to have become someone new without any single moment of transformation. The woman on the road had been genuinely at the end of something, and she had been right that the life she'd had was over. What she could not have known was that over was not the same as finished. Thatcher's hand was still over hers. "Rufus is going to be insufferable about this," he said. She almost laughed. All the way this time. He's going to be the most interested person on this ranch by a significant margin, she agreed. He'll have opinions about names. He'll have strong opinions about names. We should probably decide before he finds out. We have some time. Not as much as you think. Rufus notices things. She squeezed his hand and let go, because breakfast needed to happen and the ranch needed feeding, and the day was starting whether anyone was ready for it or not. She got up. She went to the stove. She put her hands on the familiar surface of the cookhouse that had been a disaster when she arrived, and was now, unambiguously, hers, not just managed, not just occupied, but hers in the way that places become yours when you have poured actual work and actual thought and actual life into them. The fire caught. The morning began. Outside, Ember Creek was waking into another day, not a perfect day, not an easy one, but a real one, full of the ordinary demands and unexpected complications and small unglamorous moments that make up an actual life rather than the idea of one. The cattle needed tending. The accounts needed reviewing. Somewhere in the territory, a family was returning to land that had been taken from them. Somewhere else, a man in a prison was learning what it felt like to have the system work, to have the system the way it was supposed to work for once. And here, in this kitchen, on this ordinary winter morning, Mabel Whitlock Boone stood at the stove and cooked breakfast for the people who depended on her, not because she had to, not because she had nowhere else to go, not because someone had offered her pity on a dusty road, because this was her place, because she had built it and fought for it and chosen it on her own terms with her eyes open, because she had arrived with nothing and discovered, through the slow and imperfect and fully human process of living inside a difficult year, that she had always had more than she knew. The biscuits went in. The coffee came up strong and dark and exactly right. And Ember Creek, which had been on the edge of nothing not so long ago, went on into the morning whole and working and fully, stubbornly alive.